the Act, there's about 60 pages of really exciting reading. And it is good stuff, actually. It's extremely technical. And if you're putting together a local emergency plan, an evacuation plan, then there is material there that's actually quite useful. But you do have to get through a lot of stuff which is aimed at the emergency services and all those who support them in a major incident. Now, in theory, the emergency services are supposed to work alongside the voluntary sector in managing evacuations and shelters. And certainly that happens, but it tends to happen at the more formal structured sector, where you see organisations like the British Red Cross and the Salvation Army getting involved. But taking the theory and sort of looking at our more local realities, then things are a lot different for us. And often they are sort of fairly small incidents where we need to bring our emergency shelters into operation. And whilst in theory, the local authority should step in and run the emergency shelters, in practice, it's the local response team that need to do it. And it's often the management committee of the village hall that man the refuge and get things up and running. So what we're going to do today is have a look through the basics of evacuation and then the impact of COVID-19. But I was just going to put a sort of small caveat on it, because one of the questions, or the questions that usually fly in, are all about liability. And it's something I often say to people putting emergency plans together and getting involved in voluntary activities in many ways, and that's sort of the Good Samaritan principle. So, if you've acted in good faith, if you've shown reasonable common sense in what you're doing, then you're not going to get sued. Nobody can make a reasonable case against a volunteer who's done their best. So we'll put that in there to hopefully park the questions about liabilities. So evacuation, then everything has to have definitions. So we'll have a couple of definitions. So evacuation is moving people and, in fact, animals away from actual or potential danger to a place of safety. So fairly obvious. And a shelter, so is where people shelter, but also hopefully where they're going to receive a measure of support, and we'll look at that later on. Now, we're talking about short-term interventions, so this might be a few hours, it might be overnight, certainly no more than 72 hours, absolute maximum. But one would expect that the professional providers would have stepped in before then. But we've got lots of incidents, examples of where the local emergency shelter has been used because there's been a need to accommodate people for a few hours whilst a flood passes. Incident last winter at Widden Down where lots of motorists got stranded. So there are many cases where a shelter comes into use for a reasonably short period of time. So in planning for an evacuation and in planning a shelter, the operation of a shelter, what we're looking to do is to cover a range of risks. And the question is, what are the risks? Well, that's really down to your local risk assessment and what you know is likely to happen. So it's a question of what can reasonably expect it. There's no sense in going to the absolute extremes. It's the things that are likely to impact on your community that you've identified in your general emergency plan risk assessment. And first and foremost, you've got a plan, and we always advise you to have a plan, because even if things don't go to plan, it's a good starting point. It's a framework to work to. It's brought people together. It's identified people who will step in and make things happen. But also having a plan isn't the be all and end all. It certainly needs to be practiced, and so evacuations need to be practiced, and setting up arrest centres need a few dummy runs on those. And it also needs to be reviewed. So you need to review the practice sessions. What did you learn from them? And on the rare occasions when you actually come into action, then, as well as congratulating yourselves on a job well done after the emergency is passed, hopefully, it's a good idea to review your practices and see what you learned from the experience. So putting together an evacuation plan, what are the sorts of factors we need to be thinking about? First of all, it's, do we have a period to prepare? Do we get notice of the potential need to evacuate? So if we're monitoring river levels, or if we're listening to weather forecasts, then that gives us some forewarning, and we can start to think about the potential need to activate a rest centre and to put evacuation protocols into place. On other occasions, it may be something very instant, and we need to respond quickly. Clearly, in terms of putting a plan together, the time of day is important. So if something hits during the night, it's often a much more difficult situation to manage than something where you're operating in daylights. We don't want to be too enthusiastic about evacuating. Often it's better to leave people in their own homes, so what's technically referred to as shelter in place. A number of reasons for doing that. First of all, it saves movement, it saves opening up a rest centre and putting other things together, but also in terms of people's welfare. Sometimes being pulled out of your home can be quite traumatic, and you're extremely concerned, and people feel more comfortable, even though they're having to perhaps shelter upstairs or take certain precautions. They feel actually more comfortable in staying in their own home. So we shouldn't always assume that evacuation is the first priority, and we should seriously think about whether keeping people in their own homes and keeping them safe and supporting them is an option. Also, in terms of planning, when we think of numbers, sometimes we have to plan for relatively small numbers. So it's a small area of a locality that's impacted by a flood or another weather incident, or it may be something more significant, something really fearful, like a chemical leak, which might impact on a much wider area, a much bigger community. So our planning sort of has to take that into account. We also need to think about some of the complications that might arise, and certain organisations such as schools and large factories and hospitals, care homes will have evacuation plans that will be part of their systems. But there are areas within communities, and often in small rural communities, sheltered housing is one where you might have sort of quite complex issues, and so you need to sort of think in advance about those and think about how you're going to pull that together. We also need to think about, before evacuating people, how far away is it? So sometimes village hall or a church or something is very close to the centre of the community, and it's relatively easy to evacuate people. It may be that our normal place of safety isn't a place of safety because it's involved in the incident itself, and so we might be using facilities in the neighbouring community. So again, a consideration in putting a plan together is just how far do you have to move people to get them into a safe location. As I said earlier, often the need for a place of safety is over a fairly short duration, and we need to bring that into our planning. So it may be that we're thinking about a two-stage use of sheltering. So the first one might be a local refuge where we address immediate needs, and then secondly, if more long-term support is required, then perhaps we're going to be operating with the professional agencies to address things. So it's a question of degree as to how much involvement and how much support you can give as part of a local emergency plan, as part of a local evacuation plan, and then when you need to sort of step back and let the professional help come in and guide you and take over the situation. It's also important to sort of understand that that things might not be as we would want them to be. So often the local infrastructure can suffer. So in storms, if electricity goes down, then is your place of safety operable? So can you get emergency power to it? Can you get generators involved and so forth? Is the water supply maintained, and just other things about what goes on in your community. So, is there a local shop or a pub or cafe available where sort of food and supplies can be obtained and taken along to a refuge. What we also have to do is to make sure your plan dovetails in with others. I have to say I've come across a number of circumstances where people have been putting emergency plans together, particularly for schools, and they make assumptions about what will be available to them, and particularly the village hall is somewhere, or the local church is somewhere that they can evacuate to. And I've asked, I've posed the question, well, have you asked them? And quite often the answer is no. So, potentially you end up with two groups trying to use the same building. So, the local emergency plan needs to sort of sit alongside those of others in the location. So further consideration is just how people react. So if people have got some advance warning, so if it's been raining for a couple of days and a guy in bright orange waders turns up on your door, you're hardly going to be surprised. You'll know what to expect. But when somebody bangs on the door and says you need to get out quick, then you're not ready, you're not prepared, and your action is somewhat different. And equally, we need to understand the area that we're working in. And this is where the local knowledge, and this is where the local emergency teams really do score, because they'll know the best routes to get people out of an area to the place of safety, and they'll know the local geography and how they can effectively move people around with a minimum of effort. So, types of refuges. I've already mentioned shelter in place, so leaving people in their own homes, supporting them, trying to make them as safe as possible, knowing they're there, and just keeping an eye on them. And then getting people to move to family and friends locally. That takes the pressure off the local services, because they're in a safe and secure place. But in terms of public space, then village halls, community centres, church halls, they're favourite. Often they're a reasonable size. They've got the facilities. There's toilets, there's seating, there's kitchens. So they make good evacuation centres and can be prepared. Churches and chapels, big buildings, but often a little bit lacking in facilities, particularly toilets and cooking facilities. But there's potential there, and certainly as we've been working on a few reordering projects with churches across the county, what we're doing there to sort of install modern facilities opens them up as potential places of safety. Schools, are quite useful, but village primary schools, drawback tends to be all the furniture is a little bit micro, and so are the toilets and so forth. And possibly you will be clashing with a school that also has emergency needs. Pubs are the one I'll vote for. Always a good standby. warm, welcoming food, and often very useful when you've got a small number of people to accommodate. It may be the case that you don't have sufficient accommodation, or your accommodation, there isn't really any suitable accommodation in the locality. So another method is to have a number of volunteers. So as part of your emergency plan, identifying those people who are prepared to take people in. Now, some people will do this commercially, they run bed and breakfasts and so forth, but others will just do it as a volunteer, as a good neighbour, and take people in for the duration of the emergency. And it may be that you have to draw in neighbouring communities. If your area is particularly devastated by an incident, then it may be that you need to move people out to neighbouring communities where, again, you can use their refuges or get them dispersed into those communities. But just a sort of a note of caution on all those places of refuge, and that's just avoid evacuating into trouble. So, obviously, if your village hall is just upstream of the flood, and there is a likelihood that, instead of dealing with 10 people who are being flooded, you've moved them all into one space, you've just created a bigger problem. So part of that planning process is just making sure that you are putting people into a safe and secure environment, and that you're not moving the problem sort of down the line a bit, but actually giving yourself a bigger problem a little bit later on. So in terms of activating an evacuation, then first of all, it's establishing your priorities. So who are the people you really need to get to? Who are those that are most vulnerable? Who have got special needs, particular needs that you need to address? So the emergency team will sort of work out what their priorities are for getting people evacuated. Then, if you can, give people notice. So if you give them a while to gather themselves together to prepare, then they are going to be in a better frame of mind, who could be able to work with you and be able to make the whole operation go smoothly, and give them reassurance. Say that there is a safe place for them to go to. Their properties will be looked after whilst they're vacating. You will do as much as you can to mitigate the impact of the incident on their home. So just calm and careful, and clearly just make sure that the refuge that you're sending them to is suitable for their needs, and that the refuge can accommodate people, and as I said earlier, that the refuge itself is safe and clear of the incident. Ideally, as we often lecture you during our training sessions on emergency plans, people will have their own evacuation plan, will have their evacuation pack ready, but in practice, probably not. So it's a good idea for the emergency team to provide a briefing with people on what to take, and the guidance that's provided in the template, something that every emergency team should have to hand. So they just tell people to bring the essential things that they need, to make sure they bring their keys, their insurance, their phone, some food and some clothing and whatever. Not pack for a major break, but at least come prepared to be away from home for a few hours, if not overnight, or possibly longer. And most importantly, to avoid yourself the complications later on in the day, make sure they've got medication. And one that often causes a lot of angst is people do have a responsibility to their pets, not only their affection for them, but legally they are responsible for the safety of their pets. And so they need to be evacuated as well, and they need to think about what they need to make sure that the animal is kept comfortable whilst it's away from the home. So COVID then introduces a whole host of new factors, and what we want people to do is to ideally prepare themselves in case there is an evacuation. So to think about the sorts of things that they need to do to respond to stepping out into an environment where COVID is present, where there is risks. And certainly the first thing we need to know to tell the emergency team if they are actually suffering from the virus or suspect they are suffering from the virus, so that the team can respond appropriately. Equally, if they're in a high risk category and perhaps need to be placed in away from other people. Also, we need to know if they have other infectious illnesses, other things are going on around us. You know, it's not just COVID, we're getting into the flu season, there are other things. So what we don't want to do is to spread illnesses as part of the evacuation process. So again, saying to people, right, you know, don't rely on the centre to provide it. Make sure you take all your PPE, take your masks, hand sanitizer, soap and towels with you. Go along prepared. And it's important that we emphasise to people that the emergency response team and the refuge teams will have thought through the implications of COVID and will be conducting themselves and conducting the operation in a way to minimise risk. So it's really important that people follow the instructions. Don't do their own thing, but just understand what's being said to them and respond and take notice. So emphasize to people that the need to maintain social distancing, those sorts of things tend to get forgotten when you're a bit of a panic. So, you know, again, just calm, you know, keep the social distancing and do what you're expected. We would certainly recommend that people wear masks at all times, not just when they're indoors in the refuge centre. So when they're going, because they are going to be in proximity to people, you know, it isn't always going to be possible to maintain the social distancing. They might need to be transported to a refuge. So I think it just makes it easier for everybody if everybody's seen to be wearing masks, and it just helps reduce some of the risk. People also need to think about, you know, maintaining good hygiene practices, and we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the section on the refuge. But you know, just look after themselves. So, you know, maintain the good practices, take their own PPE, wash hands, and avoid touching too many surfaces. You know, if you're in a building with lots of other people, then if you can avoid using handrails, push plates on doors and so forth, do so. Just reduce the risk yourself. In a rest centre, then children can potentially be a bit of a liability. It's going to be very difficult to stop them getting bored, and to sort of keep them by your side and make sure that they don't mix with other children, because they'll be seeing their friends from preschool, school, and so forth. They'll be seeing cousins and so forth, and their natural instinct. So it is going to take a bit of effort, you know, to keep children under control and stop feeling other people feeling uncomfortable because children are, you know, moving around the hall and potentially spreading, you know, any virus. And again, contrary to what we do normally in that confined space, then children over the age of 2 should be wearing masks, again, just to minimise the risk of infection. And then that final sort of piece of advice is to ensure that people in the refuge know if you are feeling unwell, and that's not just COVID symptoms, but anything that's likely to, you know, cause some sort of consternation, that's likely to threaten your well-being or a member of your family, or to just generally cause panic because somebody is apparently ill and everybody immediately assumes it's the virus. So some of the basics of planning a community refuge as part of your emergency plan. First of all, understanding the capacity and how many people you can fit in there. Making sure that the building is going to be resilient to events. So, you know, the basic services can be maintained, or if not, that you've got some sort of fallback position so you can get generated power in, you can get alternative forms of heating in, you can get water supplies, and so forth. And then building a support team. So complementing the local emergency planning team will be a group who are going to manage the support centre. So, you know, it may be a team from the village hall committee, it may be church wardens or the local PCC, or any other group of volunteers who are going to sort of step in and man the centre. And again, the things that you require training for, so you know, getting together, thinking about how you're going to work it, bearing in mind that you're going to be possibly working over a relatively long period, then is there some sort of rota, you know, can share the workload. Part of the management of a refuge is actually knowing who you've got there. So operating a reception, getting details of who you've got, delivering first aid if it's needed, because you've got a number of people in a building for possibly an extended period of time, then making sure that your cleaning is kept up to scratch, and you're putting catering and general support, because you know, people will have needs, people will have queries, concerns. So having a team that can respond to that. So within a refuge, sort of the really basics are ensuring that you've got adequate seating and adequate toilets, that you've got some form of catering, and that you've got good communication. So again, you know, using a building that's got inadequate facilities and no mobile connectivity isn't the greatest. Sometimes it's a case of needs must, but if again you can find a building that is well provided for, then you know clearly your management of the operation will go a lot more smoothly. Think in terms of provisioning. So it's probably doesn't make sense to have a lot of stuff in the hall just in case, because these incidents are few and far between. But what you might want to do as part of your emergency plan is identify where you can get things like blankets, sleeping bags from who volunteer them from within the community, where you can get food. So is it a local shop? Do you have to go further afield to get some sort of basic provisions? You know, can it be provided through the local pub or cafe? Also, you know, bear in mind that you're bringing people into an environment that they're not particularly comfortable in, that they may want to be communicating with family and friends, or you know, have to sort of make calls to insurers and so forth. So, if possible, have areas where people can have some privacy and can break away from the crowd for a little bit, and sort of make those urgent calls. And as I said, sort of with reception is knowing who's with you, who's in their family group, you know, where they're from, so that you can keep them abreast of how the incident is going in their area. Identifying any particular needs that they have, either immediate or developing over time. And also, if there's anybody out there who's looking for them. So, you know, if you know, a member of the household is away at work, then you need to get some messages out into the community as to who is in the community centre and where they can be found. Probably not something that will occur for many of our sort of rural incidents, but something that does come up where something big and newsworthy happens. Media can be a bit of a pest, and to some extent, managing the media can be a good thing because your bad news can engender offers of help and support and help in that way. But also, people don't want to be necessarily be pestered. So be prepared to do something. Have somebody who's prepared to be a spokesperson, but don't let reporters come wandering into your emergency centre and asking questions and doing interviews and the like. So, fairly obviously, I suppose, with the risks engendered by moving people to a central refuge, there should be a greater presumption that we keep people in their own homes or in their place of work or wherever they are at the time the incident occurs. So that sort of principle of shelter in place. Now that might take some thinking through in terms of what support they need and how you identify that sort of crossover point where it ceases to become shelter and is actually the risk is increasing and they need to be moved out. Clearly, there is a need for protection of emergency teams, so making sure they've got full PPE and probably enhanced equipment as well. So if they have got to go into difficult situations, then perhaps you've got disposable overalls, face masks, and so forth that they can use. So what we don't want to do is to have our emergency teams rendered inoperable because they can't deal with situations through a lack of equipment. So masks, visors, overalls, gloves, all the things that would help them protect themselves. As I pointed out before, in terms of the individuals and their responsibility to make the rescue teams aware of their COVID status, if they have the virus or whether they suspect they have, then the action plan needs to think about each level of risk and how you react. So clearly for those who have the virus and those who suspect they have the virus, then moving them is the very last thing that perhaps you should be doing, and it's only a dire emergency. And then you have to think about how you do that. So do they move themselves, or do you need to get specialist help from the emergency services, or how do you get people to a safe environment? And what is that safe environment? Because clearly you don't want to mix people with infections for those who don't. You also need to think about the capacity. So bear in mind that village halls and any other churches, any other community space, their capacity is severely reduced by the need to apply safe COVID practices. So we've got to keep people at least 2 meters apart. That greatly reduces the capacity. So do you need to think about adding additional places into your plan, building up other support teams, and making sure that you perhaps got alternative places. So you might want somewhere people who are effectively sheltering in high risk groups, perhaps a different location for those to go through from those who are part of the general at-risk or general population. So in terms of the way that COVID impacts on the refuge itself, one of the things we found that with emergency teams and the response to the virus generally is that a lot of teams are older members of the community and have found themselves having to disengage because of their vulnerability. And this may well be the case with your support team at your refuge. So if they are older members of your community, they may not feel secure in playing their part. And so you need to think about who else you can volunteer, who else can be drafted in to make sure you've got adequate resources to undertake it. The majority of village halls are open. A lot of churches are active for private prayer, so that they will have COVID security in place. If you're using a building that hasn't COVID security, then you need to work on that and make sure that you get all the measures in place. Whilst we've said people should be asked to bring along their own PPE, then chances are there are a fair number are going to turn up without their masks, without any sanitation and so forth. So it's being able to identify where you can get an extra source from quickly. Again, you might have a reasonable stock to maintain the COVID security of your building because it is currently operational, but you may need to think about where can additional PPE be picked up quickly. You're going to need to bring in probably more cleaning than you would do in a normal sort of refuge. So keeping surfaces clean, push plates on doors, handrails, surfaces in the kitchen, frequent cleaning of the toilets, right? People being advised to dispose of tissues and so forth. So plenty of bins in the building and ways of keeping those clear and not letting debris build up in the space. Probably the most difficult is managing the space, because you're going to have to be flexible and work around just who presents and what the circumstances are. So if you've got families presenting, you need to keep them together. Remember, COVID regulations are now that only people from a household can be together. So single households can be grouped, and then they have to be at least 2 meters, and make sure it is a good 2 meters from other groups. So it may be putting chairs around so that people can sit in groups. You can put them at 2 meter intervals so that people can converse. They're not being put in jail. They're there for the duration and trying to make it as bearable as possible. But you also have to make sure that there's room for people to move around. So again, your capacity is reduced because of the need to maintain safe gangways. One thing with village halls is they have plenty of chairs, and they're very useful in terms of marking out space. So you might not be able to mark out spaces on the floor because you need to respond to people as they come along and create space. But what you can do is allocate off spaces and divide them up and keep people parted by having chair barriers. You said children can cause some angst. They can sort of be noisy and be upsetting for people who like a quieter life. There'll be people who are concerned of children running around, potentially spreading the virus. So if you've got one or more persons in your community with sort of child management skills, who can be sort of dedicated to trying to ensure that families stay in their groups, to talk to parents about keeping their children entertained and alongside them, or perhaps providing films or something to occupy children. Also explaining to them the need to wear masks and to socially distance, just like the adults. So sometimes it can be made fun for kids in that they do adult things. Pets, again, an issue. If possible, persuade people to leave them in cars, or give them to somebody in a secure place to manage. But there is a concern now that there are some reports where allegedly animals have been the source of spread of infection. So again, pets need to be kept contained, confined, and if possible, people persuaded not to bring them into the refuge. Within our sort of general guidance of places of refuge, there is instructions there on illness management, and also as part of the COVID response. There's advice for village halls and community buildings on how to manage illness and how to isolate people, to make sure that anything that they've touched is sanitized, and a protocol for managing the space that might become contaminated. So again, that takes some particular thought when you've got a refuge up and operating. Be prepared to give assistance. People will have lots of questions. They will have lots of needs. So again, have sufficient resources and people who can help people through, and give them sort of all the reassurance that you can, that the situation is being managed, and keep them informed so that people know how long they're likely to be in the centre, if there are problems with the operation of the centre, how they're being resolved. So keep people engaged, get them involved, so that they feel that they're being looked after. They feel that those who are running the centre are sort of competent, aware of the situation, that everybody is feeling a little bit at risk, and is doing their best to make the environment secure. So I'm not going to read my way through that one, but I thought that just to keep people occupied, that's a useful one to sort of pin up in your refuge. All the reasons why you need to wash your hands, but certainly it just makes the point that notices around the refuge advising people what they need to do. And again, there are lots of those resources available, not something you have to invent yourself. Lots of it is downloadable off the internet. Okay, so that's been a bit of a gamble through local evacuations and running rest centres and the influence of COVID. So quite happy to take questions, or just to allow you to exchange views. And
thank you, Martin. Before we take any questions, I do just want to just take a moment to just add that our Devon Community Resilience Funding does enable you, if you've got a community emergency plan and you have an emergency evacuation centre in your plan, you can apply to us for funding for signage to help maintain social distancing. And we can give you funding towards a limited amount of PPE and hand sanitizer, not to be used in the hall or place of refuge generally, but just to have a stock somewhere that you can put away in case of an emergency evacuation. So I've given out a few bits of funding based on that. So I'm happy to take applications for that. Does anybody have any questions, comments, anything they want to share from their own experiences for Martin? You can raise your hand, like literally raise your hand, or use the virtual raise your hand if you have something that you would like to say. Kevin.
Hi, I might have missed this, but if someone does declare themselves to have COVID or having a test, what would be the recommendation there? Leave them where they are as far as possible, or segregate them in the community shelter?
No, leave them where they are if possible, and if it is a situation where they have to be moved and there isn't somewhere very obvious that they can move to without coming into contact with other people, then I think my first reaction would then be to seek advice from the emergency services and public health as to what is the best, because certainly what you don't want to do is to take them to your refuge. You'll just cause a mass panic. So it's finding a way of isolating them. I mean, even if it's just telling them to sit in a vehicle for a while, you know, at least you sort of move them to somewhere that's safe and somewhere that's relatively easily decontaminated afterwards if you need to. But certainly, the presumption is keep them in their home, you know, if at all possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Martin.
Michelle.
I just wondered, through the forum, is there a means of, if you like, or a central point where we could borrow generators and things like that if it was required? Is there a availability, or is it down to each individual area finding local people with generators?
Yeah.
That might be difficult on a, you know, in an emergency, whereas to ring up the central point might be easier.
Yeah. No, there is a limited stock, but let's just sort of imagine a scenario where people cannot get to you. So, you know, your basic emergency plan will identify, you know, who's got portable generators, you know, larger generators. There are circumstances, yes, certainly where Western Power, for example, will get generators out if they can. So if there's a you know, a local power failure, and something that can be addressed. But if it's if it's something wider, so a county-wide incident, so those resources are consumed, or if it's a case that the weather conditions are such that they can't get to you, then it's always best in your plan to have that sort of basic fallback: is what can we do for ourselves? What can we do locally to find generators? And you know, agricultural businesses are great sources of generators. So,
just to add to what you said, the Community Resilience Forum isn't, we don't have any resources. We're not a holder of anything that we can give to communities apart from the funding that we give out. And I guess that's part of the reason why it's important to make sure that your emergency rest centre is fit for purpose. But also, as Martin was saying, that find what resources there are in your community. That's literally sort of the heart of a community emergency plan, finding where you can source things that you might need in your community. Any further questions?
Sorry, just one. And I know, Martin, you said about not going to the point where, you know, who's liable and who's not, but obviously it is important from a parish council point of view, and we're the ones that own our plan. Do things like, you know, this the resilience plan cover everything within our public liability insurance? Is that the same for, you know, if people got experience of it from other insurers?
the activities of the support group are covered, yeah. So you're covered in that respect. And similarly, the village hall or a church or any other building should have cover through their insurance for their activities.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Okay. Thank you to everybody for coming along for that session. I hope you all found that useful, especially with thinking about this winter. Please do put in an application if you do need to get some funding to make sure your emergency rest centre can sufficiently cope if you do have to evacuate whilst we're still in the pandemic. The application is on our Devon Community Resilience Forum web pages on the Devon Communities Together website, and then that just comes through to me and we will sort out funding for you. Thank you very much to everybody who came along to the session, and thank you to Martin for giving us that run through of all of the important points with regards to COVID and emergency rest shelters. I hope you all found that useful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.